Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we reveal the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars. America's most notorious criminals from the prostitution underworld. Late at night, a quiet street. A figure steps into a car. At first, nothing seems unusual. But for detectives investigating some of the most shocking crimes in modern American history, encounters like this became the starting point of something far darker. Hidden behind ordinary streets, behind neon lights, behind motel rooms and highway stops, was a criminal world investigators struggled for years to understand. And in some of the most infamous cases, the suspects weren't the people police initially expected. They were women who operated within underground prostitution networks, and whose actions eventually led to life sentences in prison. This documentary examines the cases, the investigations, and the justice system that ultimately expose the truth. The hidden world investigators entered. Law enforcement agencies often describe prostitution-related investigations as complex, not because the activity itself is difficult to identify, but because the surrounding environment is layered with secrecy. Investigators encounter transient populations, changing identities, limited witness cooperation, and overlapping criminal activity. Cases involving violent crime within these networks can take years to unravel. And sometimes, the suspects are individuals who initially appear to be part of the environment rather than the cause of the crime. Detectives must ask difficult questions. Who was involved? Who was responsible? And what really happened behind closed doors? When investigations take an unexpected turn. In many criminal investigations, detectives begin with assumptions, patterns that appear obvious, suspects that seem likely, but some cases take unexpected turns. In several high-profile investigations involving underground prostitution networks, law enforcement discovered something unusual. The individuals they initially believed were witnesses were eventually identified as suspects. Evidence began to reveal inconsistent statements, unexplained timelines, connections between multiple incidents. The investigation slowly shifted direction, and what began as routine police work evolved into some of the most notorious criminal cases connected to the prostitution underworld. The psychology behind the cases. Cases like these often attract the attention of criminal profilers, not because they are common, but because they challenge assumptions about criminal behavior. Investigators ask, what motivated the crimes? What patterns exist across incidents? What psychological factors may explain the actions? In some cases, investigators identified patterns involving financial motives, personal conflict, escalating behavior over time. But understanding the psychology is only one piece of the puzzle, because the real challenge is proving what happened in court. The first case, a pattern emerges. The investigation began with a single case. At first, it appeared isolated. A late-night encounter. A location far from major cities. Very few witnesses. Detectives documented the scene carefully. Evidence technicians photographed the area, collected physical traces, and began reconstructing a timeline. But something stood out almost immediately. The circumstances surrounding the incident did not fully align with the initial statements investigators received. And that discrepancy led detectives to examine other unsolved cases that shared similar characteristics. What they discovered changed the entire direction of investigation. Because the more they looked, the more the pattern became visible. The breakthrough clue. Major investigations often hinge on a single detail. In this case, that detail came from forensic analysis. Investigators examined evidence collected from the scene and compared it with data from previous reports. A connection emerged. It was subtle, but consistent. When detectives cross-referenced timelines, locations, and witness statements, they began to notice that one individual appeared repeatedly in the background of multiple incidents. At first, the connection seemed coincidental. But as the evidence grew, coincidence became increasingly unlikely. Detectives now had a person of interest. And with that identification, the investigation intensified. Interrogations and inconsistencies. When investigators identify a suspect, interviews become a crucial step. But interrogations rarely unfold like dramatic television scenes. They are methodical. Detectives begin with routine questions. Where were you that night? Who were you with? What happened after? At first, the responses seemed cooperative. But detectives noticed inconsistencies. Small details that did not match evidence. Changes in timelines. Conflicting explanations. Moments of hesitation. Each inconsistency added pressure. And as the interviews continued, the gap between statements and evidence became harder to ignore. For investigators, the case was becoming clearer. But clarity is not the same as proof. That would require building a case strong enough for court. The case expands. As investigators dug deeper, they began comparing the case with other incidents reported in nearby areas. The similarities were difficult to ignore. Certain details repeated across multiple investigations. Similar locations, similar timelines, and the same individual appearing in the background of witness accounts. Detectives reopened old files. Some had been unsolved for years. Others had been dismissed as isolated incidents. But when placed side by side, a pattern emerged. And that pattern pointed toward the same suspect. At that moment, the investigation moved from a single case to a much larger criminal inquiry, the arrest. Once investigators believed they had enough evidence, they moved forward. An arrest warrant was issued. The operation was carefully planned. Detectives needed to ensure the suspect could be taken into custody safely and without warning. When officers arrived, the arrest happened quickly. The suspect was taken into custody and transported for further questioning. But even after the arrest, the investigation was far from over, because prosecutors now faced a much larger challenge: proving the case in court, building the trial case. After the arrest, the focus shifted to prosecution. Investigators worked closely with prosecutors to organize the evidence. They prepared forensic reports, witness testimony, timeline reconstructions, and physical evidence collected from multiple scenes. Every detail had to align, because in a case this complex, the defense would challenge every element. The goal was not simply to present a story. It was to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. And that meant preparing for a trial that would attract national attention. The trial begins. When the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. The prosecution opened by presenting the timeline investigators had spent years building. They described the initial investigation, the pattern discovered across multiple incidents, and the evidence connecting them. Jurors were introduced to the central question of the case. Was the suspect responsible for a series of crimes that investigators believed were linked? The defense responded immediately. Their strategy focused on raising doubt. They argued that the prosecution's timeline relied heavily on interpretation, and that interpretation, they claimed, could be wrong. From the very beginning, it was clear this would be a difficult case for both sides. The evidence is presented. Over the following days, the prosecution presented its evidence. Detectives testified about the investigation. Forensic specialists explained how physical evidence linked the suspect to the incidents. Witnesses described interactions that had once seemed insignificant, but now fit within a larger pattern. The courtroom watched as investigators reconstructed events step by step. Piece by piece, the prosecution built its case. But the defense was ready, and they began challenging every detail. The defense strikes back. Defense attorneys focused on one goal: creating doubt. They questioned the reliability of witnesses, the interpretation of forensic evidence, and the connections investigators had drawn between cases. Cross-examinations became intense. Witnesses were challenged on small details. Timelines were questioned. The defense argued that coincidence could explain the patterns investigators believed they had discovered. Because in criminal trials, even a small amount of doubt can change the outcome. And the jury would ultimately decide which story they believed. Closing arguments. After days of testimony, the trial reached its final stage. Closing arguments. The prosecution addressed the jury first. They summarized the investigation, the pattern across multiple cases, the forensic evidence presented, the timeline detectives had reconstructed. They reminded jurors that each piece of evidence alone might seem small, but together they formed a consistent picture. The defense followed. Their argument focused on uncertainty. They emphasized gaps in the investigation. They suggested that the connections prosecutors described were interpretations, not absolute proof. By the time both sides finished speaking, the courtroom had fallen silent. Because the next decision would no longer belong to the attorneys. It would belong to the jury. The jury deliberates. Once closing arguments ended, the jury left the courtroom. Their task was simple to describe, but difficult to complete. They had to decide whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. Inside the deliberation room, jurors reviewed witness testimony, forensic evidence, timelines presented during the trial. Discussions can take hours, sometimes days, because every juror must carefully evaluate the same question. Did the evidence prove the charges? Outside the room, the courtroom waited. Attorneys, investigators, family members, all waiting for the jury to return. The verdict. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom stood. The decision had been reached. The verdict was read. Guilty. The evidence and testimony presented during the trial had convinced the jury. For the investigators, who had spent years working the case, the verdict marked the end of a long process. But the legal story was not over, because sentencing still remained. And the sentence would determine what the rest of the defendant's life would look like. The sentencing hearing. After the verdict, the trial entered its final legal phase. Sentencing. During this hearing, both sides were given the opportunity to speak again. Prosecutors described the seriousness of the crimes and the impact they had on victims and communities. They argued that the evidence presented during the trial justified the maximum penalty allowed under the law. The defense responded by asking the court to consider additional factors. They presented arguments about the defendant's background and circumstances. But ultimately, the responsibility for the final decision rested with the judge, and the courtroom waited to hear what that decision would be. Life sentence. When the judge delivered the sentence, the courtroom was silent. The punishment would be life imprisonment. This meant the defendant would spend the remainder of their life in prison without the possibility of release. For the prosecution, the sentence represented the conclusion of years of investigative work. For the defense, it marked the end of a difficult legal battle. And for the court system, it finalized the case. But the story did not end there, because cases like this leave a lasting impact long after the courtroom empties. The aftermath of the case. After sentencing, the case officially concluded. Investigators who had worked on the case returned to their departments. Prosecutors closed their files. The courtroom, once filled with tension and attention, returned to silence. For law enforcement, the case became part of investigative history. For the justice system, it demonstrated how complex criminal investigations can unfold over many years. And for the public, the story remained a reminder that some of the most unexpected investigations can lead to the most significant consequences. What investigators learned. When a long investigation finally concludes, detectives often spend time reviewing the entire process, not to revisit the verdict, but to understand the lessons learned. Cases involving underground networks can be especially difficult to investigate. Investigators must navigate limited witnesses, changing identities, complex timelines, and overlapping criminal activity. In this case, detectives discovered that patience and persistence were critical. What began as a single incident eventually revealed a larger pattern. And that pattern only became visible because investigators refused to stop asking questions. For many detectives, solving the case was not just about closing a file. It was about ensuring the truth was uncovered after years of uncertainty. Why these cases capture public attention. Stories like this often capture public attention for years, partly because they reveal how complex criminal investigations can be, but also because they challenge expectations. The individuals involved did not initially appear to be the central figures investigators were searching for. Yet through years of investigation, evidence and testimony slowly revealed the full story. For the justice system, cases like this demonstrate how difficult investigations can eventually reach a conclusion. For the public, they become reminders that the truth can remain hidden for years, until the right evidence brings it to light. And once that truth is uncovered, the consequences can last a lifetime. Behind every major criminal case is a long story. A story of investigators who refuse to stop searching. A story of evidence slowly revealing the truth. And a story of a justice system working through years of complexity to reach a final decision. Because sometimes the most unexpected cases become the ones no one ever forgets. What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.